Would you join me as we light our chalice? The words to the chalice lighting are in your bulletins. We gather this hour as a table of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and beauty, in celebration of the life we share together. I was an excellent student in high school and college. I was valedictorian and then graduated magna cum laude. Education was relatively easy for me, except for high school chemistry. But I have become a technotard. My grandsons know what that is. Somebody who does not do technology. Our computer needs 3 upgrades, and I can't figure out how to sign the copyright agreement. All my friends have specialized, maximized, supersized cell phones, and I'm stuck with a landline because I can't figure out how to register and load minutes into the simplest of all, a track phone. I just want to do it right. The first time. How is this possible for a student like I was? Of course, there are consequences. Green solitaire doesn't work fast on my computer, nor do the weather maps. Those take forever to load. And my friends can't reach me when I'm driving, and I can't reach them. None of them will know when I will show up at a breakfast date or at Jiva, and I can't tell them. I say it's because a landline has been just fine all these years, and why should I want something fancy? And solitaire and jigsaw puzzles eventually work. I can brew a cup of tea in the meantime. But my circle of friends wants to know where I am because they care about me. There are things on the internet I'd like to see if I only had up-to-date software. So I'm going to be very interested in this sermon by our dear friend Tina Simson today. Maybe you share my desire to hear this one, all about being perfect, and how maybe that should be tempered a bit.
So in September of 2006, I had an awesome opportunity to attend an interfaith worship service with the Dalai Lama. It was an intimate gathering of about 6,000 people. It was at the Alumni Arena at the University of Buffalo. Maybe you were there too. His Holiness the Dalai Lama had requested this worship service as a condition of his visit. He wanted an opportunity for the many world's faith traditions to come together and reflect on the meaning of unity, peace, and compassion. I had great expectations for that day. My son Michael was a student at University of Buffalo, and he had stood in line for a long time to get tickets to the event. And our seats were in the second row on the aisle, next to the place where the procession would take place, and the Dalai Lama and all the other dignitaries would walk. Well, I must say the procession was truly impressive. It started out with native tribes dancing down the aisles in full costume with feathers and furs. It was beautiful. There was drum beating, and they were followed by dignitaries from other faiths. There was an imam from the Islamic Society, ministers from the Presbytery of New York, There was the Episcopal Diocese, Baptist, African Methodist Episcopal, and Unitarian Universalist. There were other people present, the Society of Friends, Baha'is, Hindus, a Sikh, a rabbi, and a Catholic bishop. And these folks were totally decked out. I mean, they had all of their stoles and their robes and their chasubles, brilliant colors of white and purple, and the many symbols of their faiths on their outfits. Our Unitarian Universalist minister was dressed in a tasteful blue suit. Once the interfaith dignitaries reached their seats, the Dalai Lama's procession started in the back of the auditorium. He was surrounded by monks in gold robes, and there were bells and horns blowing and a huge canopy over him, and he walked past me within arm's reach. Now, people had told me, people who knew I was attending the service, they said, "You will feel his presence. You will feel his holiness." Now, as a good Unitarian Universalist, I was a little skeptical about this. But I was wrong. When he passed by me within touching distance, I felt an essence of human kindness emanate from this man, from his being. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before or since. I was in awe. I was so pleased to be there with my son Mike and his lovely girlfriend Sarah. I wanted everything to be perfect. And it was. Until His Holiness sneezed. Now, you see, it was September and hay fever season in upstate New York, and the Dalai Lama was suffering from one of those sniffly days. He sat cross-legged on his great big special red chair. He was a holy vision until he started reaching into his sleeves and pulling out hankies and wiping his face and stuffing them back in. My image of grace and dignity was becoming flawed. It certainly wasn't perfect. And that's what I had desired going in. Well, the service continued, and it had a gentle grace as each faith tradition came forward with a prayer or a song or a dance, all about unity and compassion and peace. It was beautifully choreographed. And there was a person whose responsibility it was to MC the event, and he just sort of made the whole thing come off perfectly. One event after the next, until he made a mistake. He introduced a faith tradition out of order, and all of a sudden there was rumbling and confusion. It all went pretty fast, and things got back on track. But it was clear he had made an error. There was an audible gasp in the auditorium, and the MC, he was visibly disturbed and deflated. And then the Dalai Lama spoke. His presentation was anticipated by thousands in the audience, and he began by looking directly at the MC and saying, "You made a mistake." I felt so bad for this man. I was like, oh my gosh. But then His Holiness continued. He said that this mistake was a great gift to all of us. That, see, we often sit in the world like people on this stage behind him, dressed in our most perfect and glorious costumes. Costumes, he said, that separate us from one another and get in our way of true compassion. It isn't the way we look on the outside, he said. It is the imperfections of life that remind us of our humanity and our purpose to live in unity with one another, with compassion and deep love. That, he said, is our purpose. And in that way, he began his message to us. I'll never forget that day or that lesson. I sat in the presence of such holiness, and I almost missed it. Because he didn't quite fit my desire for the perfect image of divinity and devotion. He was human, and he sniffled, and he sneezed, and he stuffed hankies up his sleeve. And yet he offered us a remarkable gift, one that I hope we revisit today. See, we often desire perfection. Am I right? Am I not the only one here who thinks everything ought to go my way? We desire it, we chase it even in our relationships, in our community, in ourselves. And the risk here, I think, is that desire, this pursuit of perfection, actually keeps us distant from one another. Think about it honestly, just for a moment. Consider the last project you completed, the last meal you cooked, maybe the last decision you made, the party you gave. Remember the last exchange you had with a loved one, a friend, or a child. Did you bemoan the fact that it just wasn't perfect? Did you think that it could have been better if only you, fill in the blank, spent more time, been more patient, less judgmental, smarter, more skilled, made more of an effort? Or maybe the other guy was the one who could have helped more, could have done her share, given you what you needed, been a better partner, or loved you the way you needed to be loved. See, this desire for perfection causes us to spend energy that, if redirected, could truly shift our existence and open us to a deeper, more meaningful, connected world. In this desire for perfection, we often perceive others or ourselves as lacking. Now, I think it's a dangerous two-step, you see, because it keeps us from devoting ourselves to a cause or a community or even to a church because it isn't perfect. And at times we shy away from connections because we aren't perfect, because we don't measure up. We resist commitment or connection because we compare ourselves to others and our ideal isn't matched. And from that place of comparison, we experience misery tied to a perception that we will never get what we want, or that we will never measure up, or both. Now, if you wonder how this can play out in real life, imagine for a moment your role in your own neighborhood. Do you enjoy when your neighbors stop to chat? Or do their political signs make you cringe just a little bit? Are their kids too noisy on a summer night? Does their dog make a mess in your yard? Before you know it, you turn away, keep to yourself, avoid the neighborhood picnic. It's not perfect. It's your neighborhood. It's not perfect, but it never will be. Or look closer into our relationships. Well, our partner forgot we were having a bad day and races in with their own agenda. A friend forgets our birthday or the date we arranged to have coffee. Your brother spouts out his point of view that hurts us deeply. Our college kid won't answer any method of communication, text, Facebook, email, or even mental telepathy. And that's it, right? We shut down. We turn away from our lovers, our friends, and our family. It's not perfect. It's not what we desired. But then again, it never will be. And even take a look at our religious communities. We wonder if our opinions fit in here. We say, it's good here, but it's not totally right. There's not enough God, or there's too much God. I need more ritual. I need less ritual. My questions aren't answered. The sermon doesn't thrill me. The music just isn't my type. No one here knows my name. I think I'll stop coming. It's not perfect. It's not what I desired. But it never has been, really, and it never will be. And it's not a reason to turn away. In each of these situations, we just dig slightly below the surface, we're likely to find deep disappointment and perhaps a little bit of self-doubt. You see, when we don't get what we want, When life doesn't measure up to our expectations or desires, we become disappointed and perhaps begin to doubt that we actually deserve what we desired in the first place. Now, disappointment is a powerful emotion, and I don't know anybody who really likes to feel it, but it can teach us so much about ourselves. We often kind of slough it off or discount it. It's hard to be disappointed when our desires are so high and reality just doesn't measure up. But I think what happens when we feel disappointed is, rather than feeling our deep sadness, we elevate the ideal, right? So we cling to the desire for perfection. Well, it's not my fault. I'm not disappointed. They were wrong, or they're not as good as I'd hoped it would be. We push it outside of us rather than allowing it to make us disappointed. We are looking to avoid suffering. But I think what often happens is that we become more isolated and more alone. We set ourselves apart. We avoid imperfect and messy aspects of living, and that is exactly where we find the love and connections we crave. Not in the perfect ideal, but in the mess and the mire. So how do we get out of this cycle? How do we stop chasing more and better and learn to accept ourselves as less than ideal? You see, I think it's human nature to want life to go our way, to see what is possible and not settle for what it is. I can even say that it has served humanity well to extend our reach. We've evolved, right? We wouldn't do that without extending our reach. But I think there's a sweet spot in this. When it comes to human action, the sweet spot between being disheartened and angry and finding satisfaction in a life that is ordinary and blessedly imperfect. I think we need to be willing to be disappointed and yet stay in the mire. We need to trust that there is no part of life that is perfect, and there never will be. Our hope is that the snarl of relationships we can find enough to feed our soul and satisfy our heart. Dr. Timothy Miller is a researcher and a clinical psychologist, and he wrote a book called How to Want What You Have. His book begins with a quote from Albert Camus. If there is a sin against life, it consists perhaps not so much in despairing of life as in hoping for another life and in eluding the implacable grandeur of this life. Our own UU tradition calls us to live and love this life. It challenges us to be grateful for what we have and to not give in to insatiable desires, which drive us to want more, big, better. Yet I think the instinct to never be satisfied and focus beyond the present moment is very strong. Our whole society calls us in that direction. I took a trip to the library to do some research. I walked down the aisle where there were stacks of self-help books. You can solve any ill in the world and become perfect in many ways. There's a strong cultural pull. Dr. Miller challenges his readers to live a life of compassion. And by doing so, we will come to appreciate what we have and give up striving for those things we don't have. And then he defines compassion this way. I've never heard it said quite as well. Miller states that true compassion is the intent and belief that you are no more entitled to get what you want than anyone else is. I'm going to say that one more time because when I first read that, I had to put the book down and breathe deeply. True compassion is the intent and belief that you are no more entitled to get what you want than anyone else is. Imagine that in the fullest extent of its meaning. This compassion is based on the conscious understanding that really everyone wants the same things for the same reasons. Almost all human desires arise from the same instinctive sources. We desire to be safe, to belong, to love, and to find meaning in our lives. If we hold this compassion in our heart, judgments about inconvenient, imperfect people and situations might just start to fall away. Because the assertion that another person or situation is imperfect, bad, wrong, weak, ugly, lazy, or stupid is just a disguised assertion that we are more entitled to get what we want than he is or they are. See, I think this misconception is at the core of seeing ourselves as separate. Stepping away from judgments opens this door to compassionate dialogue and relationship. Another spiritual teacher, Jan Phillips, puts it this way: talking about us and them like our lives aren't intertwined is archaic. Thinking our own religion or party or nation has all the right answers is foolhardy and arrogant. Not admitting that you are co-creating culture you live in is irresponsible. Our problems are rooted in the notion of our separateness, while our separateness and solutions are suspended in a field of unity. So there it is. Together and with compassion, we co-create our culture. It's hard to imagine what might happen if we adopted this worldview and integrated this meaning of compassion and unity into the way we live every day. But I suspect it would eventually make us less angry as a people, less confrontational, more peaceful, more patient, and more caring. If we walked forward with our hands open rather than our fists clenched, I believe true connection and creative transformation would be possible. Now, I do understand that it's hard to change a feeling and a desire for perfection, and a feeling that we're entitled to this perfection, which, by the way, I suspect we all have in some areas of our life. My sermon today certainly isn't going to change that. But if we accept the idea that compassion has the potential to change us, then see it as a lifelong spiritual practice, not just something we think is a good idea, but that we practice every day. I believe it's possible to change in a way that allows us more connection and less solitude. There is an old Hasidic tale. Story of a rabbi who was in a conversation with God about the meaning of heaven and hell. The rabbi asked God to explain to him the difference between heaven and hell. "I will show you hell," said God, and he led the rabbi into a room. In the middle of this room was a very large, round table. And people were sitting all around the table. They were starving and they were desperate. And yet, in the middle of the table was a large pot of bubbling, delicious-smelling stew. There was more than enough to feed all of the people in the room, and the smell was so delicious that the rabbi's mouth began to water. He observed the people around the table holding spoons with very long handles. Each person at the table found that it was just possible to reach into the pot and take the spoonful of stew, but because the handle was so long, it was impossible to get it back into their mouth. The rabbi saw that they were suffering and that it was terrible. "Now I will show you heaven," said God. And they went into the other room, and it appeared exactly as the first one at first. There was the same big round table in the center. There was the same pot of bubbling stew. The people, just as before, were equipped with the same long-handled spoon. But they were well-nourished and plump and laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company. At first, the rabbi couldn't understand. "It's simple," said God, "but it requires a certain skill." You see, they had to learn to feed each other. So friends, let's take our long-handled spoons. Let's dig into the pot of this rich, delicious stew of life, and let's feed one another. Allow the messy, imperfect love and connection to fill our hearts. If compassion is the root of our desire, we need only a little bit of help to change the world. May it be so, and amen.
Someone's hand to take, let no one stand alone. And we'll say the words to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Go in peace.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor Daniel Brigham.